African greys are interesting because we're seeing more and more atherosclerosis in them, and that's an inflammatory condition, and that's on birds that are on pellets.
Welcome back to the African Gray Journal. In my opinion, the most overlooked and important element of parrot keeping is diet. Now, today we have a very special guest. This is someone who's dedicated his life to avian nutrition, specializing in whole food nutrition and dietary enrichment. So please welcome biologist and avian nutrition consultant, Jason Crean.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on the show, Jason. It's really a pleasure to have you on. And I've been watching a lot of your interviews lately, and I'm just happy to be able to ask you a few questions today.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about food all day long.
For sure. So I know, many parrot keepers are always looking for the most convenient way to feed the best diet possible, which is why pellets have become extremely popular. But in your experience, what issues have you seen in parrots that have been fed a predominantly pelleted diet?
So I think that there's a lot in that question, and there's nothing simple
Right.
about feeding parrots, and we have to. That's the first hump we have to get over.
Hmm.
Parrots are opportunistic feeders. They eat a host of different things. They are built. They have evolved over countless generations to, regardless of the species, to forage for food, spend most of their day doing that, actively looking for different types of food. And what's awesome about parrots, and one of the reasons that they do make good pets or can make good pets, is they can adapt very well to a host of
Hmm.
different environments, different foods, things like that. So, um, yes, there's a convenience factor, but we still, uh, so going back when pellets were first introduced, I remember I was working at a pet shop in high school,
Hmm.
and we went to a seminar hosted by one of the companies, and we really thought this was going to solve all the problems. And shortly thereafter, I had graduated from college with my first degree in biology, and I remember meeting Dr. Karen Becker, who's the most followed veterinarian on social media, really a diet specialist, and she thought the same. And
Hmm.
then she saw, she had 15,000 active clients, so she has a large data set. And we would talk about, we're still seeing lots of birds that are plucking, lots of birds that are
Hmm.
self mutilating, lots of birds that still have vitamin A deficiencies, which you would see on an all seed diet as well. So, it's not solving the problems. And what it also was doing and also is doing is if it's the predominant part of the diet, it's robbing them of enrichment.
Right.
And that means that they're not able to use their brain and use their beak and use their feet and all, hang upside down and, do all the stuff that they would normally do to get access food, because everything's in this simple shape, and
Right.
it's not really based, the nutrients or the food items that are included aren't really naturalistic. They wouldn't be eating these
Right.
things in the wild per se. So all of that combined with the fact that it's that most pellets are processed, which means they're, elevated heat, and that
Right.
brings on inflammatory compounds. So, I still see, and I have people come to me, and this every week. I see tons of this. My bird's plucking, my bird has inflammation, my bird has arthritis, and they're basing their dietary information on what their vet is recommending.
Right.
And you know, I chose not to go to vet school. Thank God I made that choice. But the nutrition that they get with, particularly avian nutrition, they get like a
Mhm.
day, a lesson
Wow.
on parrot nutrition. They don't get an adequate education in nutrition, and that's one of the reasons why whenever I'm invited to a vet school to speak on bird nutrition, I take advantage of that, because I think you can't feed them like a dog or cat. And I would argue dogs and cats need to be on raw food diets, but that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
But when it comes to feeding parrots, there is no predominant part of the diet in a parrot diet. There shouldn't be. They should not have predominantly one item that makes up the diet. So when we see birds, like I mean, I don't have plucking birds. I don't have birds that are mutilating. I have very content birds that are nutritionally sound. I have blood work done on a host because I have about 50 different species here, and
Wow.
none of them have nutrition deficiencies. No blood work has ever shown that, and I'm
Hmm.
not feeding pellets. So, I offer to what really one of my birds. I offer tops now and then as a
Okay.
supplemental thing because that's the only pellet that I'll recommend because it's cold pressed and that means that you're taking that heat processing out of the equation. But I'm not seeing any problems with feeding a diverse diet of soaked and sprouted items and fruits and veg and things like that.
Awesome. And that's definitely a great point because when I think about a completely whole food diet, sometimes I'm immediately worried that I'm not satisfying all of their nutritional needs. So just considering all of that, how should one approach feeding an African gray parrot just to ensure all of their needs are met in terms of getting that diversity and also the vitamin requirements?
Yeah. And African grays are interesting because we're seeing more and more atherosclerosis in them. And that's an inflammatory condition. And that's on birds that are on pellets.
Right.
And I remember talking to Irene Pepperberg with Alex the African gray years ago about,
Hmm.
diet and things that they do. And, it was really disheartening to hear, about his loss. And
Right.
when we find the reason, it was, even sadder. But when you look at, when you're looking at a parrot, there's macronutrients and there's micronutrients. Now,
Hmm.
macronutrients are very easy to discern because it's proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and there is so many different easy ways to get that into a parrot. People, at the beginning of every lecture I give on bird nutrition, I put a picture of sunflower seeds and I ask the audience to give me their feedback. What do you think?
Hmm.
What does this make you feel? And I hear poison, toxin, like all this ridiculous extremism. And
Right.
then I show all of the nutritional benefits that science has shown around sunflower seeds and why for humans they're a health food, right?
Hmm.
And I say the problem with sunflower seeds is that that was the predominant part of the diet in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then we had all these birds that had terrible, terrible problems, health problems, and we wondered why, right?
Right.
And so we went the other way to the other extreme, and pellets came out. So now we've got these two extremes, and no one should be at either of those extremes. You really should be in the middle where you're offering a diverse diet of many things. If you're offering a diverse diet, they're not going to get too much of any one thing. Now, that being
Right.
said, macronutrients, easy. Fats, birds need fat. Even if they're sitting in a cage, they need healthy fats, especially omega 3 fatty acids. And that's something that we're looking into because there really aren't any useful omega-3 fatty acids in hand feeding formula, and omega-3s are
Hmm.
critical for nervous system development. So what happens if your nervous system isn't developing properly? And I would argue, having worked with teenagers for a long time, we see that too. In
Right.
humans, it's a problem, and we have a host of different, mental issues that are surfacing after not giving proper nutrition early on. So with the macronutrients, easy to do. Proteins, fats, carbohydrates. We know what's in the food. We can give them a
Mhm.
host of different things. And birds, parrots in particular, are because they're opportunistic feeders, are really good at extracting those nutrients that they need.
Okay.
Micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, things like that, those are needed in small amounts, hence the word micro. So they don't need this vitamin A, but beta carotene load every day.
Okay.
Like we don't get our nutrients every single day, 100% of our nutrients every single day. There's this myth that you have to get all your nutrients in every day. Birds, a tree will bloom in the rainforest. They gorge on it. They eat a ton of it, and then tomorrow they move on to something else. Or they can only eat so much of this food because there is a toxin in it, and then
Mhm.
they need to move on to something else. And that's how trees have evolved to deter animals from eating them completely and spreading the wealth around. So those types of things. It's easy to get macronutrients and micronutrients from a host of different foods.
Mhm.
And I would argue, and I continue to argue, that the best way to get those are from whole food where it's not processed, it's in the natural state and not synthetics that are added, sprayed on pellets.
Right.
There's this synergy where there are nutrients in foods where there's other compounds that help you digest them, help you assimilate them. which is missing if you're just feeding a vitamin A supplement.
Right.
That's why even with pellets we still see vitamin A. And my colleague Dr. Jamie Abetti, who's a vet in Chicago, avian vet in Chicago, says we see the same thing. It's vitamin A deficiencies regardless of the diet, and that's why she's very pro more whole foods, more soaked and sprouted items, more fruit and veg, because that's what takes care of it.
For sure. I guess it's similar to an analogy you had in a different podcast that you were on, where you mentioned when us humans take a vitamin C supplement, the majority of it gets expelled through our urine. But if we took it in a natural form, it would be readily absorbed because of those other compounds. So I think that makes a lot of sense. It makes me really think about things differently here.
Well,
Um,
and when you think about fat soluble vitamins, if you're not
mhm.
giving healthy, useful fats, you can't assimilate fat soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K, right? You can't. But we tend to think if it's on a label and it goes into my bird, it's taken care of. Nope.
Right.
I'm here to say no, that is not true. That is absolutely resoundingly not true. And unfortunately, in America particularly, we eat a ton of processed food. It's cheaper, it's more accessible, and we we have a couple generations who really don't know what's healthy.
Right.
And because I get people contacting me like, well, my bird eats pasta, and I'm like, pasta is not healthy. Dry pasta is definitely not healthy. And they're like, oh, but pasta, it's whole wheat pasta. It doesn't matter. It's a
Right.
processed food.
Mhm.
Anything that's heated to the point of dryness where it can sit on a shelf for a long time, you
Mhm.
really need to second guess, right? Like that's just, it makes sense that it's not healthy. And when I just saw this short film clip on Facebook, and it was an Italian chef, and he's comparing the pasta that you would buy in Italy with the pasta you would buy in America, and he's like,
Right.
"This is really hard. Why is this really hard?" And it's because it's so
Mm.
processed, and the pasta they're feeding is softer. It comes in a bag. It's just very different. And when you look at the research on processed food and particularly heat processing food and the inflammatory compounds that brings on, it's going to lead to disease.
Hmm. Interesting. And just speaking about like processed food, would you consider freeze dried or dehydrated fruits and vegetables processed, or would that be a more natural form of preservation?
Yeah. What's great about freeze dried food is it's really heat that's the problem. And that's why I tell
Mhm.
people don't feed cooked rice, don't feed cooked pasta. Those it's just not worth it. Plus, cooked food spoils a lot faster. That's another myth about whole food. People are like, "Oh,
Mm.
I can't feed my birds sprouts because they'll spoil during the day." No, they won't. These plants have defense chemicals that protect
Mhm.
them. They grow in the wild without molding. I think they're okay if your birds
Right.
molt for a few hours. But when it comes to the processed idea, freeze dried is, I mean, we think it sounds like it's processed, but what's beautiful about freeze dried is it captures the nutrients. Up to 95% roughly of nutrient is captured in that food, so totally viable and stable. But it has to be in a container that has no moisture and no oxygen. So usually you need
Right.
those little pads in there to make sure that it's kept dry. Because as soon as it starts to grab moisture from the air, it starts to lose its integrity.
Right.
Dehydrated, you lose about 50% on average of the nutrient. It's left out even at low temperatures, like below 105 is what most people recommend when you're dehydrating, but it's still losing things because it's oxidizing. It's left out in the air. It's exposed to air, and um, it's another way to introduce diversity, but
Yeah.
it is and I would say it's better than processed food, overall for sure. But it is you do lose more nutrient with dehydration versus freeze dried. Freeze dried is more expensive, but
For
I
sure.
feel like it's worth it. And I invested in a freeze dryer a couple years ago, and started a
Nice.
little business specifically producing things that would keep birds active. Freeze dried palm nuts. Birds, oh my God, the birds go crazy for them. They
Wow.
absolutely love them. Yeah. So it's really interesting to see what can be freeze dried, and how we can preserve that, and help make it a little bit more convenient for the bird owner.
Got it. Okay. And you did mention cooked foods. I know you do your best to not cook any of your foods. Everything
None.
is pretty much raw. Are there
Yep.
any vegetables that you feel should be cooked or steamed before feeding to just release certain nutrients or
So there's exceptions, but they don't need to be.
okay.
Sweet potato is one, and that's another myth I see online a lot is, sweet potatoes have to be cooked or they're toxic. No, they have anti-nutrients, but a lot of what parrots eat in the wild has anti-nutrients, and
Hmm,
those are just things that um, keep certain nutrients from being absorbed by the body. But it's not like it's going to hurt your bird.
okay.
So I feed whole raw sweet potato. I have for 15 years. We've been feeding raw sweet potato, no problems. Birds love it. It's enriching. They really have to work at it. And the Association of Avian Vets just last year, I think it was, put out some information about don't feed cooked or mashed soft foods to birds
Mhm.
because it kicks some of them into breeding mode, hormone mode,
Right.
and that makes sense, especially when they're regurgitating to each other and warm, soft, like disgusting. But we try to avoid that, and like I said, cooked food also spoils much faster, and it will spoil things around it that it's mixed with. So
Mhm.
if you do lightly steam some sweet potato for your bird, don't mix it with raw food. It'll make it spoil that much quicker. But when it yeah, I mean I there's no reason to cook.
Right.
There's no reason.
Got it. Okay. And I'm just curious in terms of like feeding. I know we spoke a little bit about enrichment, but how should parrot owners prepare the whole foods for their parrots? Do you feel like the chop strategy is the most effective, or would you rather larger chunks for the parrots to actually hold and play with and stuff like that?
Keeping birds is a scientific experiment that never
Yeah.
ends.
Yeah.
So you have to figure any way they're going to eat it is what's best. Now, I've got a black pound cockatoo, Sirius. He's my buddy, and he likes to pick up very tiny things and grind them in this giant beak.
Hmm.
So I do chunks and smaller chunks and chop largely for him, though he likes larger chunks on a skewer too. But he was also raised on whole foods. So if you're trying to get a bird to eat things, you would be shocked at how many canaries, finches, cockatiels, budgies like a whole leaf of kale hanging in the cage versus
Mhm.
finely chopped tiny pieces.
Right.
You got to keep in mind, Mother Nature's not out there chopping food for your birds. These birds have
Yeah.
to figure out how to eat things, right? And make it work. And so they're eating grasses and they're eating um, larger leaves. They're eating nuts and fruits. They're burrowing into fruits to get to the
Mhm.
seeds. Um, there's just a lot of different things. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Evie Voltura, published a paper with the Association of Avian Veterinarians last year in the Journal of Avian Medicine and Surgery. And it's called, I brought it up just so I had it, Parrot Dietary Habits and Consumptions of Alternative Foodstuffs. And what she
Uh,
did was she just looked at what research has told us over the years about what parrots eat. And she has it listed 74.7% have been seen actually consuming wood,
Oh, wow.
eating wood, fiber. It's fiber, so there's a probably a reason for that. 44% have been seen eat pure minerals, so that could be quartz and
Mm,
clay and things, soil like that. 91.2% foliage. So most parrots that have been observed in the
mm.
wild are eating some kind of leaf as part of the diet. 76.9% eat terrestrial invertebrates,
Interesting.
bugs, snails, things like that. So
Right.
when I tell people that every parrot should be eating, you should be offering like mealworms or something like that, you can imagine the vitriol sometimes that emerges as a result of that.
For
But
sure.
that's a human thing. That's a human bias. That's not a parrot bias because every parrot in particular, because I go through about 20,000 mealworms every few weeks here. Like we have a lot of birds that eat mealworms. I have Victoria crown pigeons and different types of fruit doves and toucans and things like that. And they go through a lot of bugs. But every parrot that I've offered live mealworms to, it's like they instinctively know how to eat them,
Wow.
and even if they've never seen one before. So it's pretty interesting what they can eat. 34% of parrots have been seen eating vertebrates. So that's lizards, snakes, things like that.
Wow.
Sap, 30, almost 30% eating some kind of sap from a tree. Almost 20% eating roots. 18% eating charcoal. So like they're eating a lot of different things that we're not even coming close to in a standard parrot diet. And
Right.
so there's a lot of things that we could be offering. Um, the edible mushrooms. I keep seeing mushrooms as toxic. Toxic mushrooms you should not feed to your birds. Like that's a
Right.
no-brainer. But if they're edible
Exactly.
mushrooms, there's a ton of benefit. And what's beautiful about mushrooms is if they're left in the sun, they can create their own vitamin D. And so,
Right.
and parrots have been seen to use that type of vitamin D better than we can. So, um, you know, it's just there's a lot to think about. It's not cut and dry. It's not simple. But if you are diversifying the diet and you exercising portion control so that they are eating the diversity, you can't go wrong.
Got it. Okay, interesting. I definitely the diversity is it sounds like a major impact on their health, and I'm just curious when I speak about like soaking seed and sprouting, soaking seed or nuts and sprouting seeds. Sometimes people can get a bit hesitant because they're afraid of possible bacteria developing in the water while these foodstuffs are soaking. What do you think is the best way to prepare these fruits and vegetables, is to ensure that we're either cleaning them properly or we're soaking the seed properly without introducing pathogens to the birds?
So the best way to there's a couple of questions in there. I'm going to take the first one on cleaning first.
Got it.
But cleaning produce, what they found in a recent study, I want to say 2017 maybe, was that an alkaline environment actually gets rid of 99% of pesticides on the surface of fruits and vegetables. So
Okay.
that means baking soda. So a baking soda solution, um, on your fruits and vegetables will remove most of what's on the surface. You're not going to get a ton of what's inside, but generally most of it's on the surface. So you want to get rid of that.
Right.
Vinegar isn't going to hack it. Vinegar
Mm.
may help kill some pathogen, not necessarily pathogens, but microbes. But
Mhm.
that would have to be a separate wash. So I know people use apple cider vinegar as a be all end all. We have not seen it be very effective in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
The only thing when I ran bacterial plates in my lab was there was zero growth when we used grapefruit seed extract, and that's
Okay.
what we use in our sprouts. So soaking, um, rinsing seed thoroughly and soaking it in just plain cool water overnight, you don't have to worry about bacterial growth. That's fine. You're going to rinse it the next morning.
Okay.
When you dip it so that they can sprout another, let's say 12 to 24, 36 hours, depending on how long you want your things to sprout, um, you can add some GSE to the water, dip it in the solution, and then just let it sit. And I have never had any bacterial issues whatsoever. I know lots of people that don't even use that, and they just make sure they rinse every few hours. And that's really all that's needed. So I think that a lot of people have been scared
Right.
by sprouts, but the reason for that is the sprouts in the grocery store that are in those little plastic cages, little plastic containers. Those you have no idea how long have been sitting there in that container. Those develop bacteria because there's nothing to deter them, and there's a lot of pathogenic bacteria that loves the inside of plastic containers, like Pseudomonas bacteria, which will kill your birds. So I always tell people just sprout your own, and don't, if you're worried about bacteria, there are things you can just soak overnight, rinse in the morning, and feed immediately. There's things that you can soak for 10 to 12 hours, sprout for 10 to 12 hours, and bam. And that's how I do it. Within 24 hours, I've got a whole crop of sprouts that I can use that I then put in a sealed container and put in the fridge and feed from that for several days. So there's easy ways to do it, but don't fear food. You got to stop
Right.
fearing food.
For sure.
Ultimately, pellets and processed foods are going to have the same type of issues because it's food. Things are going to grow on those. And when you look at dog food recalls, it's largely kibble. It's not raw meat based diets, it's largely kibble. So, you got to keep these in mind. Just because it's dry doesn't mean it's safer by any stretch of the imagination, especially when pellets get wet. If you've ever smelled wet pellets, ooh, That is
Yeah.
some nasty stuff.
Absolutely. And I do remember you mentioned a while back that you actually soak nuts as well.
Yeah.
I actually had never heard of that until I seen you say it on the podcast. So what are the benefits of actually soaking nuts? And are these raw nuts that you're soaking?
Yeah. So nuts are seed. I mean, they're
Right.
basically, and it's it's uh it's funny how many light bulbs come on when I do my talk on bird nutrition, because I always talk about
Mhm.
seeds, and most people just don't associate them with like plants, like potential plants. And a
Right.
seed is what plants produce, and they have to, because they can't move, right? If plants moved around, we none of us would be here. They would have taken over the planet by now. But
Yeah.
these plants produce seeds, and they have to give that baby plant everything it could possibly need, except water, which ultimately activates growth. But they have to give everything to that seed so it's ready to go. And so the seeds have starch and proteins and fats, so that those they can use those as sources of energy to start building new cells as soon as they get wet. And then as soon
Mhm.
as that little sprout has leaves, photosynthesis takes over. They can make their own food. But they got to give them enough to get to that point. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. We're trying to capture that moment where they are transitioning all those nutrients into something that's more nutritious, more accessible to the body. And seeds are a nut. Seeds are, they've got, sorry, nuts have great healthy fats, but if they're tree nuts, so you're looking at things like walnuts,
Mhm.
pecans, pine nuts, Brazil nuts, filberts, which are hazelnuts. Those are the big ones. Macadamia,
Mhm.
that will have those omegas that you need. Almonds are great, but they don't have omega-3 fatty acids really. So, they're okay, but they're not the best. But when you soak them out of the shell, just raw nuts out of the shell, and I just soak them overnight, rinse them, feed them,
Mm.
you're activating them to the point where they start to break down some of those nutrients that make them less digestible so that they're more
Uh,
digestible. And
okay.
when you look at people who are on vegan diets, for example, a lot of their food is nut based because there's so much, they soak nuts, so that they use soak nuts as a base for a lot of foods because
Mhm.
it's nutritious. You can get a lot out of them, in that little package.
Got it. Okay. And when it comes to roasted nuts, what are your thoughts on feeding roasted nuts to parrots? Because I know that's something readily available in most supermarkets.
Yeah, I like I said, I don't recommend anything heated. I
Right.
think you lose a lot of nutrient when it's heated, and there's no reason for it.
For sure. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. And now, just staying on the diet of the topic of whole food. So, what are some warning signs that some people should look out for when they're feeding a whole food diet, just to make sure that all of the nutritional aspects are being met? Are there any signs we should look out for just to make sure?
Um, I mean, it depends on the nutrient. So there's
Right.
like it's really difficult to quantify that. I think that if you're taking your bird to the vet once a year for blood work and a wellness exam, usually those things can be detected,
Okay.
through there. Um, if your bird is experiencing, if it's exhibiting any type of issue, I always look at diet first. When I look at birds that are on diverse whole food diets, and on my Facebook group, I've got tons of 21,000 some people, and no one is reporting whole food has killed my bird. My
Right.
bird's not getting what they need. Like it's a pretty big data set. And I'm part of other groups, like there's a few whole food groups for parrots in Europe that I'm part of and things like that. And people just see benefits. They don't see a whole lot of negatives. And like I said, that's because parrots are really good at extracting those nutrients from the little bits of food that they can get.
For
When
sure.
it comes to inflammatory conditions, I've seen inflammatory conditions undone through diet. So
Hmm.
arthritis, um, plucking, self mutilation, things like that. I think that I don't think diet can solve all the problems, but I definitely think that diversifying the diet, not only for mental enrichment to keep them more active and foraging, but
Hmm.
also for physiological, working, making sure that the
Right.
body's functioning because they're getting all of these bioactive components that haven't been heated to the point of dryness and are inactive now. So you would know, I mean, you would probably know if something's going on with your bird, even though birds tend to hide illness. You can still tell when
Right.
something's awry. So, as soon as you see something like that, go to the vet, have blood work done, see if there's something, um, biochemically wrong, and then work from there.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, that definitely sounds like amazing advice there. And I'm just curious. I know uh, with different parrot keepers, you'll always get different perspectives. You know, if you have someone that free flies their birds compared to someone that just has a household pet that they take
Mhm.
out and just allow them to fly with. Are you altering the diet based on their activity level as well? So if they're free flying, are you adding more protein or fats, or is it just going to stay a really diversified mix of foods?
Yeah, I think the portion control that I always recommend is typically for the standard bird. But people that are
Okay.
free flying know that their birds tend to need more fat, for example, because birds
Right.
really use those fats as their energy source. So you'll often notice that as soon as a bird free flies and comes back, many of them are immediately rewarding them with nuts, and
Right.
that's often the best way to replace some of that used energy. Um, but birds, even if they're sitting in a cage, still have some of the highest metabolic rates of vertebrate animals.
Hmm.
Their heart hums, right? Like a vet when they're listening, their heart hums. So they have a very active. But flight is, and let me just say, flight is not the only exercise. Most of the exercise parrots do is climbing around tree branches, walking, things like that. And what research has shown us is that birds in general use flight as a last resort because it does take so much energy. It can be a big waste of energy if it's not used for good reasons. So birds, we tend to romanticize the wild and think it's this beautiful, lush paradise. Nature is really, really rough. So they're flying for reasons. And
Right.
when it comes to flight, they generally will prefer to walk or use their legs over their wings any day.
Got it.
And so when you're feeding, give them opportunities to forage so that they are using other parts of their body. They should be hanging upside down to reach food. They should be, don't put it in a bowl thinking you're doing them a favor. Like,
Right.
really, you got to mix it up. You got to keep, birds should be used to change. Every day they should be like, I don't know what you're going to put in my bowl today.
Right.
I put some peppers in Sirius's bowl this morning. He doesn't get peppers every day. So, it keeps them thinking, keeps them guessing, keeps them foraging, actively foraging. I'm producing a short film for my job right now on the science behind zoos, and one of the experts that we're going to be interviewing is at a zoo where they've completely taken their gorillas off processed food and put them all on a
Mm.
produce-based food. And they've seen decreases in gut inflammation, and they spend twice as much time foraging. So mental and physical enrichment all together just by removing that one piece. And now other zoos have started to look at that and followed suit. So if we could start expanding that to other species as well, that would be great.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was just thinking the other day just about maybe I'm making life too easy for my birds just by placing the food in a bowl. They just walk over and
Yeah.
eat. And in the wild, they'd have so many different challenges. So I'm just curious, what ways are you tackling enrichment with your aviary and really challenging your birds in terms of their toys or the way they eat?
So the best thing that anybody watching this can do is buy a stainless steel skewer. It'll last the lifetime of your bird most of the
Hmm.
time. Um, I had a blue throat macaw that kind of challenged me on that, but
Got it.
usually they last. But you want convenience and enrichment and foraging all in one. You get a
Hmm.
skewer, you spike a bunch of stuff on it, and you hang it in the middle of the cage and let the bird reach for the food and destroy it. I have birds that, like, they wouldn't touch an apple until I put a whole apple on there, and then they were
Uh,
all about destroying it. And that's probably because birds see things differently than we do, right? They see UV light reflectance.
mhm.
So they're seeing the outside of a fruit the way that nature intended. And they're
Right.
seeing it and going, oh, that's food. I recognize this as food because I'm seeing the outside of it like I
Mhm.
would in the wild. And so peeling apples and chopping them up in little pieces may not be as appetizing to a bird than if they see the whole thing, or a slice of apple with the peel on it, for example, something like that. But I put it on a skewer, and that bird was all about apples all of a sudden. So, whole
Huh.
peppers. I love putting like a bell pepper cut half across and stuffing it with sprouts and stuff like that, and putting that on a
Mm.
skewer and letting the bird just destroy the whole damn thing. Like, just
Yeah.
let them have fun. Birds are messy, and we wouldn't have a rainforest if any rainforest if they weren't messy. They spread seeds all over the place for plants,
Right.
and that's why they're messy. So they're going to be messy in your homes. It's just no way to get around that. But that stainless steel skewer, that is the best tool that you have, because you can do so
Mm.
much with it. One day you can hang it from the side. One day you can hang it up here. I mean, there's just so many different things you can do. And then there's a lot of other foraging toys that are out there where you can stuff them full of, the cage, the metal cage where you can stuff it with nuts and leaves and, all kinds of stuff. I get eucalyptus leaves and eucalyptus nuts and stuff like that. And I'll mix those with tree nuts like walnuts. And, I just stuff the cage full, and
Right.
that could be days worth of enrichment.
Wow.
So there's lots of different ways, but yeah, I think a lot of people anthropomorphize,
Hmm.
and they think, oh, the bird's my baby. I need to make life as easy as I can for it. You're not doing your
Right.
bird any favors. It's just like raising a kid. You got to challenge them. You got to let them think, learn from failure. You got to let them,
Right.
struggle. Struggle. Like, part of the struggle is overcoming it, and that we need to empower our birds to engage in that struggle, and that's where those foraging. And I mean, it could be something as simple as throwing nuts in a paper bag, crumpling it up, and throwing it in the bottom of the cage. You
Right.
don't have time one morning, do that. And then, you come home from work, the bird has ripped it open and got to the nuts and had some fun. So there's lots of if you don't follow Robin Sullivan at the Leather Elves, you probably need to, because she's got a lot of she does a lot of live streams on Friday nights off her Facebook page. She's got a lot of great enrichment ideas.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be sure to check her page out for sure. One thing I've been doing is, like, if I'm feeding like a sugary fruit, I'll just put it on top of the cage and just let them
Yeah,
try
let
to
them
eat it
pull it
through the
through.
cage bars.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So that's one trick that I've been doing. But yeah, those are some great tips, definitely. And I'm just
Yeah,
curious when it
and
comes.
that's great with branches too. Like any
Oh,
kind of branch that's safe. I've got a bamboo forest behind me that I planted, and I'll just
nice.
chop some bamboo, throw it on top of the cage, and just let the bird spend all day ripping things through.
Yeah.
Um, anything to keep them occupied, but they're using their naturalistic behaviors. They're doing what they would be doing, using all those parts of their body that they would be using in the wild. So
Got it. And when it comes to toys, I know you mentioned branches and other things, but what do you think about the toys that are currently available for us parrot consumers? Are they more geared? Are they marketed for humans and not birds? Or
yes.
I gotcha.
Yeah. So I mean, birds should be chewing wood.
Right.
That's what they do. I think that I tend to put my money where I'm going to get a lot of bang for the buck. So
Right.
I want foraging. I want toys that have foraging. I want uh, Robin Sullivan at the Leather Elf sells natural birch toys that still have the bark on them. And I
Wow.
watch birds for hours destroy those, peel the bark, things like that. And that's naturalistic. We know birds eat bark, tree bark. Um, so I think there's a lot to be said about the more natural the toy, the better, when it comes to encouraging parrots to use those naturalistic behaviors.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And I did want to quickly jump back to diet just a little bit here. I know, when it comes to African grays, a lot of people recommend palm oil on the food. Do you add any oils to your foods to supplement fat in any way?
No, I think there's plenty of fat in tree nuts and things like that. Do
Right.
I think a few drops of palm oil here and there is beneficial? Sure, it's got beta carotenes and some other stuff in it that's beneficial. Do I think African gray should have it every day? No, I don't think any bird should have anything every day. But
Right.
I think that there's a place for some oils, um, particularly if you're treating your bird or it has some kind of issue you're trying to overcome. But when it comes to oils, you want to make sure that they're balanced, and that would
Mhm.
be omega 3 to omega 6, or omega 6 to omega 3, 2 to 1. And those
Right.
are generally going to be purchased at a health food store in a refrigerated section.
Okay.
Don't buy any kind of oil, not palm oil. Palm oil is a kind of a food, more or less, and same thing
Hmm.
with coconut oil. Both have great benefits, but birds don't need them. Definitely don't need them every day.
Right.
But when it comes to using these oils in order to supplement omega 3s, it would be in a refrigerated section of a health food store. Whole Foods, Sprouts, those types of stores have refrigerated sections with these different oils in them. And the oils would be in a brown tinted glass bottle or a brown plastic bottle, because light will inactivate those oils. They're very fragile when they're extracted out of their food state. So,
Got
and you need to use them up pretty quickly, within weeks versus months, even if,
it. Right.
despite the expiration date, because omega 3s, if you look at them funny, they denature, they fall
Yeah.
apart, they just don't work. So, there's things like borage and primrose oil, flaxseed oil, hemp seed oil. All of those are great sources of omega 3s, but I want to give my bird flaxseed with the fiber, the whole flaxseed or ground flaxseed mixed with their food, because I want them to get all of that, not just the oil. But
Right.
if your bird's trying to overcome some kind of health issue, or let's say you took in a bird from a pretty bad environment and you want to try to give it a boost, some omega 3 fatty acids are going to be really beneficial.
Got it.
But,
Okay.
but most birds don't generally need a seed oil as part of their diet, if
Got
they're
it.
eating a diverse diet, at least.
Makes sense for sure. And I know the convenience factor is really important for a lot of parrot keepers out there. And I know you've done some work with bio bird blends. Now, is there any product by individual teams like bio bird blends or other uh stores that would be able to give a diversified mix for the dry mix? I understand like the wet mix will definitely get from a produce store, but is there any specific mixes for grays?
So at biobirdblends.com, what I did was I put together bundle boxes so that
Hmm.
there is a mixture of seeds, grains, nuts, tops, pellets, like that only cold pressed pellet out there without anything synthetic, if vitamins,
Right.
along with my flower forage, which is a bunch of different edible flowers, and my green forage, which is a bunch of different herbs and greens that are dried, that can be mixed with food, wet or dry.
Okay.
And so it if you do a bundle box, and let's say you make, and what I'll say is this: everybody that has a bird should have 2 hours a week somewhere, divided up or together, where they can
Hmm.
prep food for their birds.
Right.
That And honestly, if you can't spare that kind of time, you can't spare that kind of time working with your bird either. Like, I have a concern about that if you're a bird owner. So
For
if
sure.
you can make the time, and honestly, I work a lot. I have a lot of different positions, and managing my bird collection here is, I'm hand feeding 3 toucan chicks right now that they're
Wow.
sucking up a lot of my time because they have to eat every 2 hours. I still make the time again for a couple hours where I prep the food. It could be that I mix all the sprouts together. I add my green forage to that so that all those dried herbs mix in with the sprouts. They absorb excess moisture, but then the birds get all of that oregano and thyme and all these other different types of greens
Right.
mixed in with their sprouts. I'll add chopped vegetables and microgreens that you can just mix all together. And then I've got a spoonful. Every spoonful from that is dozens of different foods.
Right.
And it only took me so long to mix it all together and put it in a sealed container in the refrigerator so that I can pull from it during the week while I'm busy.
Right.
It's not hard. It's not hard. Anybody can do it. And all it does is take a little bit of learning. and your bird will be so much better for it. They'll be happier. Like, I hate to anthropomorphize and say that they'll be happy, but you see the content, like they get excited and stimulated by what they're eating, and all of these different things that they can consume. It's so boring to have one type of food all the time, or most of the food. 70% of the diet should not be one thing. It's just wrong. It's not good for birds.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that. That was a great statement there. And I think that really ties everything together. It really comes down to the mental stimulation and also, taking care of their body and their physical well-being. So really appreciate your time, Jason. This has been fantastic. I've gained so much knowledge on this podcast, and really I'll be sure to follow your social media channels as well, just to stay updated with what you're doing. And yeah, I look forward to speaking with you in the future and continuing to learn as much as I can. So thanks again for your time. Yeah.
We're all learning. Birds teach us every day, so we're never done learning.